So I'm so glad you guys are all here. And welcome to our capstone of Utah's Archaeology and Historic Preservation Month. I'm Elizabeth Hora. I'm public archaeologist at the Utah State Historic Preservation Office. And today I'm welcoming Dr. Joe Joseph to our program to talk about the particular challenges facing the identification and preservation of historic Black cemeteries across the nation. Dr. Joseph has worked with African American sites across the southern US, including cemeteries. As the former president of the Society for Historical Archaeology, he led a burial grounds working group that developed guidance on treating abandoned cemeteries, and he worked with the SHA's government affairs representative to discuss the needs of the African American burial grounds. Dr. Joseph's presentation today will grapple with the loss of African American burial grounds as a result of a particular trajectory of history faced by Black people in the US. And he has a lot of ground that he wants to cover this evening, so I'm going to get out of his way and let him get to it. Dr. Joseph, thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you everybody that's in the audience. I will be giving you basically dinner and a movie. So if you, what I'm going to do is show a film on the Avondale Burial Place, and then after showing that film, talk about the challenges that African American burial grounds are facing, because these are unmarked places of the American past that are unfortunately being too often encountered during development. Now, let me give you a little bit of the background to the Avondale Burial Place before we start the movie. The Avondale Burial Place was discovered by the Georgia Department of Transportation. Now, the GDOT had surveys done for this road improvement project. That archaeologists had actually covered this landscape and had not recognized that there was a cemetery there. And so that tells you immediately how difficult it is to identify cemeteries associated with an impoverished section of the community that did not have the rights to own property and land to set it aside for their own use and designation as cemeteries, and therefore also came into other circumstances that led to the abandonment of burial grounds. We were brought in to do the recovery of the Avondale Burial Place, and one of the other challenges of working with the African American past is trying to find out whose past it really is. Yes, we know it belongs to the African Americans who lived in Bibb County, Georgia, but we did additional research to try and find and trace who some of the descendant communities members might be so that we could engage them in the work we were doing.
Give me a thumbs up. Can you?
Survive slavery. I do remember, that's why I believe.
Driving along Georgia Highway 49 as it crosses from Houston County to Bibb County, heading toward the communities of Rutland, Walden, and Avondale, you pass by woodlands dotted with the occasional home, business, or farm. What are now woodlands were once fields. Looking past the trees, one can imagine the end of the plantation era with the Civil War and the beginning of the time of tenant agriculture, a new period in history. Bibb County, Georgia was established in 1822. Agriculturally productive lands along creeks and rivers were quickly bought and made into plantations. By 1830, Bibb County had a population of 7,154, nearly 42% of whom were enslaved Africans. Planters mostly grew cotton, which was sent to Macon by wagon, and then shipped downriver to Savannah and on to textile factories in Europe and the Northeast. While the Civil War brought plantation slavery to an end in 1865, Many African Americans remained on the former plantations, working as tenant farmers on the same land their slave ancestors had worked before them. African American tenant farmers were members of a close-knit community. Marriages between families built connections. Groupings of tenant houses were found on former plantation land, and while tenants and their families would have worked individual fields, they would have come together for religious services, weddings, funerals, and other social events. Living in rural areas, like southern Bibb County, African American tenants would have occasionally traveled to the small towns of Walden and Avondale for church services and other functions. As African Americans left the region, some fields were abandoned and became wooded. A landscape was lost, forgotten. But clues to its past remain. That wooded triangle in the corner of Land Lot 130, it was never used for agriculture. Why not? What happened there? At this wooded triangle, the Georgia Department of Transportation and African American history intersected on the Sardis Church Road Extension Project, which will connect Interstate 75 to Hawkinsville Road and the Middle Georgia Regional Airport.
The Sardis Road Extension Project was really in its sort of final phases. The environmental had been cleared, and the property for the road was in the acquisition phase. An appraiser in our right-of-way office contacted us because in the negotiations they had had a conversation with Mr. Lucas where he was a little uncertain about whether his historic property had been properly evaluated during the environmental process. So the right-of-way office contacted me. I made contact with Mr. Lucas, and we met here on site to look at a historic building that he owns. In the process of that, as I was about to leave, he pointed over to a wooded area and stated that there was a slave cemetery in that area, and asked if we were aware of that. And it's where the road was going to go, and I told him that we were not aware and that I would investigate that.
She was taken to this wooded triangle of land, which the neighboring landowner had been told was once an African American cemetery.
A few years ago, we were contacted by DOT to meet them out here, and they were talking about a project that they were considering at the time of extending Sardis Church Road into Avondale Road. They had shifted the road over to Mrs. Home because it seemed like it had significant historical importance. I said, well, what about the graveyard? He said, what graveyard, Mr. Lucas? I said, over there in the woods. The whole cemetery was fenced in at one time. The farmer over there had cattle grazing out there, and he kept the fence up so the cattle couldn't get into the cemetery area.
The cemetery contained no monuments, markers, or other visible evidence of human burials. But through archaeological testing, the Georgia Department of Transportation, or GDOT, confirmed that graves were present. GDOT archaeologist Sarah Gale used several techniques to identify the number of graves in the cemetery. Members of Alpha Team Search and Rescue were asked to bring their search and rescue dogs to the site. These dogs have been used to find human remains in various settings, and they have received training that allows them to identify human burials. Multiple dogs and trainers worked the area independently. All of the dogs marked locations where their sense of smell indicated burials might be found. Next, ground-penetrating radar, or GPR, was used to create a three-dimensional view below the ground surface. GPR also identified burials in the area. The presence of burials was confirmed with test trenches. Due to an established cemetery on one side and wetlands on the other, the proposed road could not be shifted to avoid the burial ground. In order to preserve and protect the remains, the decision was made to recover and relocate these graves. New South Associates, a cultural resources management firm, was hired to conduct this relocation. Since there were no records of a cemetery and it had no name, the project team called it the Avondale Burial Place because of its proximity to Avondale Mill Road. Under the direction of Dr. Hugh Maternis, New South used a backhoe to strip away the soil to where they could see stains in the ground left by the grave shaft. Soil stains, which archaeologists call features, are left where soil is dug up, mixed, and redeposited. The archaeologists were able to identify the locations of grave shafts as rectangular stains in the red clay. 101 burials were identified at the Avondale Burial Place. The archaeologists then began the process of excavation.
Our initial expectation was that we were going to have a small group of individuals who are out here placed in a fairly tightly defined area. And we discovered that that was not the case at all, and in fact, we had three different groupings that are present. In African American communities, your families were very tightly knit social units, and you tended to bury with your own kinfolk. Most of the African Americans here in the South, some of the poor white farmers are people that are not terribly well represented in the historical record, and we don't know a whole lot about them. They didn't leave a lot of traces behind, and one of the best resources we can have to tell their story, to put them back into history and back into people's minds, actually comes from the cemeteries. The skeletons tell us an enormous amount of information about their lifestyle. The cemeteries in themselves, the way they're laid out, they tell us a lot about the way they viewed the world. For me, this is very exciting to be able to find a community where we know practically nothing about them and be able to reconstruct their world and tell their story. It gives them back a social identity, a social presence, which unfortunately they've lost through the passage of time.
What happened to the families whose loved ones were buried at the Avondale Burial Place? Who were they? Where did they go? Federal census records were used to map the locations of African American tenant families in the areas surrounding the cemetery in the late 19th century. These names were then used to search for potential descendants. GDOT hosted open houses during the project, sent notices to local African American churches, sponsored talks and presentations on the project, and generated press releases, all in the hopes of identifying descendants. Charmin Southall searched genealogical websites for descendants. Her efforts were met with success. She identified the descendants of two families, one African American and the other white, who had lived in the project area.
After Mama died in 1961, I was going through some of her papers and I found a newspaper article back from 1943 from the Macon paper about this MacArthur property in Bibb County and about a quilt that had been made for one of the descendants. This article told about John MacArthur having come to Middle Georgia in the early 1840s and bought property there. The article told about where it was at the end of the runway. The will of John MacArthur that was written, I think it was 1846, was the thing that really gave me this interest in the MacArthur family. When I read about the different things that he was given to his children, and attached to the will was an inventory of his property, beds, furniture, cotton, and things like that. And it included 12 slaves and their names and ages. And that was the first that I knew of my ancestors having been slave owners.
Tallery Boyd and Reverend Skip Mason were descendants of Ellen Barton and Hardy Thomas, two African American women who were likely born as slaves on the MacArthur plantation. The Barton and Thomas family names were frequently identified in federal census records for the surrounding area.
I consider myself one of the most blessed, I won't say lucky, but really one of the most blessed persons in the world, because my family history research has sort of come full circle. Now with the discovery of this cemetery and these 101 remains, of which we believe very strongly that there are some in there who are related. Very few people get the opportunity to trace their family back, but even more so to have a cemetery associated with it, and to have the discovery of these remains, you know, and to do research and to learn how they lived and how they survived and what conditions were. When I was first approached about it, you know, I was a little bit ambivalent about it. I had some mixed emotions. Why move them? You know that they're there. Let them rest in peace. You know, why disturb them? Can't you reroute and redo this highway now that you know that? But, you know, after I listened, you know, to some of the rationale of, you know, what would happen, and what intrigued me most was the fact that they were going to study the remains. That said a lot. Not just dig the remains up and move them and put them somewhere else. For me, I found that to be real disrespectful, just to get a highway in, but that they were going to study them. And the fact that there might be the possibility of doing DNA testing. For me, it soothed my soul and many of my family members.
The life of a tenant farmer was very difficult. By the early 20th century, Southern African Americans began leaving the region in search of jobs in the industrial cities of the Northeast and Midwest. World War I and the Immigration Act of 1924 increased the need for industrial workers in cities such as Baltimore, Chicago, and New York. Racial tensions in the South and violence by the likes of the Ku Klux Klan spurred African Americans' desire to leave the region. Millions of African Americans left the South from the early 20th century through the 1970s in what became known to historians as the Great Migration. This migration was felt in Bibb County. In a September 1916 article, the Macon Telegraph commented,
"Everybody seems to be asleep about what is going on right under our noses. That is, everybody but those farmers who have wakened up on mornings to find every Negro over 21 on his place gone, to Cleveland, to Pittsburgh, to Chicago, to Indianapolis, and while our very solvency is being sucked out beneath us, we go about our affairs as usual."
Of the 101 burials at Avondale, 63 were infants and children, a large number that reflects the difficult lives and early deaths of African American tenant farming families. Charms such as pierced coins and beads worn for spiritual protection were found with many of the burials. One artifact, found with a young child, reflected the simpler aspects of life.
I was working my way from the head to the feet, and as I got to the upper arm, I found something white. And I thought at first it was a shell, which is a pretty typical inclusion in African American graves. And as I uncovered it, I started uncovering the face, and it sort of exposed her little face and then her hands. It was as if the little girl, about 2 or 3 years old, was cradling it in her arm. The mother or family lovingly placed the doll in with the child before they buried her.
The nails coming out of the screens provide a wealth of information if you record the data correctly on these. When we're in the field, we make a diagram of each of the individual interments, and as you can see, the little dots on here, these indicate where each of the nails are placed, where they were originally located. We record the depths of these as well that tell us where the nails were found originally, and from this we can reconstruct the shape and the form of the type of receptacle that the individuals were buried in.
Archaeologists discovered coffin hardware, items such as handles, thumb screws, and viewing plates. The style of coffins found at the site provided clues to a family's economic condition. While most of the coffins were of a very simple construction and were probably locally made, others were more formal, with ornate hardware, which suggests that some families were able to spend more on a funeral.
Coffin hardware is extremely important to us. From an archaeological perspective, it appears in a very short period of time, and we can use this to precisely date some of the coffins and then some of the graves. For the people who are using these coffins, it served both functional and symbolic purposes.
The archaeologists studied and recorded the shapes of the burial shafts themselves. Several of the burials were placed in vaulted shafts. A grave shaft was dug, and then a coffin vault was placed in its base. Wooden planks were then placed over the coffin vault to protect the coffin from the weight of the dirt when the grave shaft was backfilled. All of the 101 graves from the Avondale Burial Place were oriented with the dead facing east towards the rising sun. The organization of the burials was informal, with gaps between rows, suggesting family groupings. No historic records of the cemetery were found. Graves with simple coffins and few remains were difficult to date and could have been placed at any time from settlement in the 1820s to the late 19th century. Some artifacts, such as a campaign token from William Henry Harrison's 1840 presidential campaign, found around the neck of one of the deceased, indicate that people may have been buried at Avondale Burial Place prior to emancipation. However, archaeologists were able to date the majority of the burials from 1870 to 1890 by identifying various types of coffin hardware, clothing, and other items. Physical anthropologist Valerie Davis analyzed the bones to determine the age, sex, health, and race of the individuals.
When we bring skeletons back from the field, I pull them out of the tissue paper and I clean them up using paintbrushes and toothbrushes. Then I do all of my metric analysis so that I can see if they were males or females, how old they were, diseases they may have had, maybe what they died from, and I do that using my calipers, different kinds of calipers for different kinds of measurements. And I record everything on my skeletal forms so that when I write my report, I have all the information right there in front of me.
This analysis and DNA testing conducted at the University of Oklahoma confirmed that these were the remains of African Americans. The analysis showed that the Avondale Burial Place community performed hard physical labor. They had poor nutrition and inadequate health care. Damage to bone joints in the arms and legs of adults showed that many had literally worn out their bodies long before becoming old. Over half of the burials in the cemetery were infants and children, a much higher percentage than what would have been found in European American populations at the time. Like other African American families in the South, many of the descendants of Ellen Barton and Hardy Thomas left Georgia for other parts of the country in the early 20th century. They settled in New York, Illinois, Florida, and various other states. For over 25 years, members of the Barton and Thomas families have held reunions where genealogical research, old photos and documents, and oral traditions are shared. As attendance at these reunions has grown, lost connections have been restored.
Lorenzo Wilder, Thomaston, Georgia.
Tawanda Myrie from Queens, New York.
Eloise Byron, Tampa, Florida.
Gabby Burnett from Deaconsburg, Georgia.
Mary Boyd, I'm from Uniondale, New York.
Jalen Scott, Jacksonville, Florida.
Morgan Wilder from Hyattsville, Maryland.
Keon Clements, Loma City, Georgia.
Beverly Redfield, Cleveland, Ohio.
Cheryl Robbins, Upper Marlboro, Maryland.
Lisa Wilder, Clayton, North Carolina.
Paulette Downing, Cleveland, Ohio.
John Wilder Sr., Augusta, Georgia.
Karen Castillo Payne, West Palm Beach, Florida.
Reverend Henry Byron, Tampa, Florida.
was held in Macon, Georgia on Memorial Day 2010. During the reunion, descendant families visited the burial site to observe the excavation, ask questions of the archaeologists, and commemorate the dead.
Didn't really know anything about the family. We just came together and met each other, and then now to find out that we have ancestors that were buried here is fascinating.
And unfortunately, they don't survive as well, but there are several traits on the pelvic bone that should be able to
The more we search out and try to find out different little things, it seems like they're opening up paths to let us know, okay, you need to go this route and maybe look more into this. I don't know, I just feel like that sometimes, like a lot of the things that I research, that the spirits are there to guide me a little bit because they know I'm searching for them, so they're going to help me out in finding them. So eventually I think we'll kind of get a little bit more of a feel of the family structures of who are really buried here, and if they are my ancestors. Nobody even knew this place existed. So by us uncovering it, it's like we're remembering them in some kind of way, even if they're not related to me. Yeah, I still feel a connection.
Give you thanks right now, Lord, for this beautiful day, this wonderful, gorgeous day, Lord. On the back of your shirt, you have a scripture that comes from the book of Ezekiel. And it says, "The hand of the Lord was upon me. And he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, as we've seen today, the bones that were very dry. He asked me, 'Son of man, can these bones live?' I said, 'O sovereign Lord, you alone know.'" Well, I have prayed and asked God for some confirmation whether or not these bones live. And the answer is yes. These bones live in us. We are the descendants of these people, our ancestors, those we know and those we don't know. I think all who are here have been incredibly enlightened, and it's been a life-changing experience for many of us to see what happens after we commit our beloved and loved ones to the earth.
The remains from the Avondale Burial Place were reburied at nearby Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. Descendants of the Barton, Thomas, and MacArthur families and others attended a memorial service at this new burial ground in February 2012. The Avondale Burial Place was an African American cemetery created sometime in the 19th century and used into the early 20th century by tenant farmers. The discovery and analysis of the Avondale Burial Place helps us to understand African American life and death in the rural South, to bring light to a historic African American place and give new life to old bones. The Avondale Burial Place, once forgotten, is now remembered.
That worked. All right, so the Avondale Burial Place is just an exceptional project. I think we were very fortunate that our historians and GDOT's historians were able to trace and identify members of the descendant community. Too often with the African American past, we see artifacts, we see structures, we know they're African American, but we cannot put faces and names in association with what we discover as archaeologists. Working on the Avondale Burial Place was the first project that I had the experience to work with human remains detection dogs, working with Alpha Team Search and Rescue. We have since used human remains detection dogs on several different projects, including several other African American cemeteries. And we found them to be a great means of identifying where burial locations are. At Avondale, we knew from having done the GPR that we had a cemetery location. What we didn't know was how far the cemetery extended out. And so using the human remains detection dogs gave us the ability to survey the woods surrounding the project area to confirm that we had indeed identified the full limits of the cemetery. Now, looking at Avondale, you see some of the challenges in the past of African American burial grounds. If you go back to the plantation era, and that's true for the late 18th and early 19th century across much of the U.S. then, you will find that African Americans were restricted from property ownership. There were laws in Georgia that prevented African Americans from owning property. And so we believe at Avondale that the cemetery was established likely on the MacArthur plantation and then continued to be used into the tenant period. And you might wonder, well, why in tenancy, if African Americans had their freedom, why would they continue to be buried on plantation land? Well, burial was a difficult thing to achieve. It would not be until the 1870s and 80s that churches began to appear in the African American communities, that church cemeteries, formal cemeteries are established. And there's a very strong tradition in African American community that you are buried with your kin. You want to be buried with other family members. The belief is that your family and the spirits of your family all belong in the same place. And so we've seen this on other situations where African Americans from the plantation era continue to use the same burial grounds into the 1870s and 1880s, into the 1890s, often until a landowner prevented them from using that ground as a burial site any longer. One of the other patterns that we saw at the Avondale Burial Place that is being explored by other archaeologists in Georgia is that use of a landlot corner as a burial ground. So if you think back to the plantation era, what the planters were looking for was the arable land. They were looking for the level land that was easily plowed, ideal for growing crops. When you have a landlot system that's comprised of rectangular plots of land or square plots of land, those corners of land lots where the surrounding land lots are owned by someone else are difficult to plow. You can't really plow well at right angles. And so we see that those locations were often avoided by the crop layout, and therefore would have been less sort of marginal land that the planner may not have had any objections to use as an African American burial ground. So let me go forward into how this helped to lead us to the African American Burial Grounds Network bill. As an archaeologist working with African American cemeteries and African American sites, I'm very familiar with the number of unknown African American burial grounds that have been discovered by archaeologists. And these are almost always unknown to property managers, to developers, to landowners. They're only known in the African American community itself. So as the president of the Society for Historical Archaeology, I formed an African American burial grounds working group with the intent that we would put together guidance that could be disseminated to African American communities to help them understand the techniques that they could use to identify cemeteries, but then more importantly, to get cemeteries protected. And that is one of the other challenges that we face, is that burial laws are very uneven in this country. Our legal system is set up to favor the landowners, and landowners are quite often unwilling to acknowledge reports that they may have a burial ground on their property. We run into this even today with developers who may call us out to do survey on a property they're looking at. And quite frequently we'll hear on the call from the developer, well, they say there's a black cemetery on this piece of property, but I don't think that's true. I've walked over it. I haven't seen any headstones. I haven't seen, any monuments. There's no fencing. There's nothing to indicate that a burial ground is present. Well, again, coming from impoverished settings, African Americans would mark their burial sites with impermanent materials. They would mark them with field stones. They would mark them with wooden monuments that might not survive. And so they do not leave the same type of surface indications that white cemeteries leave. And again, when cemeteries are established on land that belongs to someone else, they are quite rarely recorded in the deed records as being the location of a burial ground. And so the working group put together a series of recommendations for what descendant communities could do to get their cemeteries, family cemeteries, properly recorded, getting into the legal record, and better maintained and protected. And those recommendations are hosted now on the Society for Historical Archaeology's website, sha.org, under the research resource section as the burial ground recommendations. So if anyone that is working with a descendant community that may want to provide some guidance to an abandoned African American cemetery, that is the first place to go. Now, having done that work, part of being a SHA president is going to make visits to Congress, going up on the Hill to talk to the staff of various senators and representatives about concerns that the historical archaeology and the historic preservation community have. And so in making a series of those visits, I would speak out about the issues confronting African American burial grounds, abandoned African American burial grounds, and the need to gain some sort of protection and recognition for them. So when you go in, and should you ever go in to meet a congressional representative, first off, you will almost certainly meet a staffer, which it's very rare to meet the congressperson themselves. But typically they will assign a staffer who will meet with you, you'll talk, they'll take some notes on your concerns, they'll relay them to the congressperson, and that will be the end of your visit. I always like to talk with the staffer as a sort of a way of warming up the conversation, get a little bit of sense of who they are, what their background is. And so Marion Werkheiser, who is the SHA's government affairs coordinator, and I, during a series of visits on the Hill, went to meet with Representative Alma Adams. We met with her staffer. Her staffer came in, we were talking, and it turned out that her staffer had gone to the University of South Carolina, where she had started out in historic preservation before switching to political science. And so South Carolina is also my alma mater. We talked a good bit about Columbia, South Carolina. We talked about what faculty that we had in common from the historic preservation area and the historic preservation field. And from there, we went into our discussion of various issues of the SHA, including the African American burial grounds. And it was that one contact that led to the bill. The staffer was very receptive, said she thought that creating a bill to provide some sort of guidance and protection and resources for African American burial grounds was something that her representative would be willing to support. So having got somebody who was willing to sponsor a bill, both Marion and I were looking at what goes into a bill. And we had discussions about some of the things that we'd like to see included. And Marion had a recommendation that there had been a recently passed civil rights network bill, and that should be a model for what we were looking for, that we should seek to design an African American burial grounds network bill that would empower the National Park Service to provide resources and training, and ideally financial support to African American communities to allow them to get their cemeteries recorded, cleaned, maintained, properly recognized. And so we sent ideas up to Alma Adams' office. They went to the House bill writing office. We reviewed draft bills, and out of that came the African American Burial Grounds Network bill. The bill was introduced in the last Congress. Because of the administration at that point in time, it did not have particularly high hopes. It went to committee on the House side. It was only heard in one committee. It was well enough received that the Senate introduced a counterpart bill, and there was a little bit of movement, particularly on the Senate side. Sherwood Brown, the senator from Ohio, was the backer of the Senate bill, and he was very aggressive in trying to get some support for it. Late in the last Congress, we heard that Senator Brown had introduced a study bill counterpart to the bill in the Senate. Now, a study bill is, in essence, it's like a baby bill. Instead of introducing the bill itself, a study bill would have empowered the National Park Service, directed the National Park Service to study the need for a bill such as the African American Burial Grounds Network bill, and then decide whether to then come back to Congress with a recommendation of whether or not a bill was needed. That actually passed the Senate unanimously in December of last year. We had hopes that it would get over to the House and pass, but at that point in time, the president just did not sign the COVID relief bill, did not sign the defense bill and budget bills. And so the House was tied up in trying to passing funding measures that were needed for the nation. And as a result, that Congress adjourned and no bill was passed. The African American Burial Grounds Network bill is in the process of being reconstituted in the House. And we think the timing is actually more in our favor now. The National Park Service, which was lukewarm to the bill under the previous administration, is much more receptive to the bill. They've come to the light and they see the need of the bill. The Coalition for American Heritage and the National Parks Conservation Association have done some major survey efforts to gain support and buy-in from a wide range of African American organizations and community members. And they're now working with Representative Adams' office to redraft the bill in an updated format. And we're hoping that the redacted format will include funding, because this is an issue that really it needs federal support and recognition, but it also needs funding to help African Americans get their cemeteries identified, maintained, recorded, and protected. The bill would contain a number of different pieces. One would be to provide that training and assistance to African American communities in the maintenance of their cemeteries. A second would be to provide funds that could be used to to cover maintenance, cleaning, other services of cemeteries, proper deed recording of cemeteries, funding that would include doing archaeological surveys to have cemeteries identified. Another component of the bill might include creating a registry, national registry, where African Americans could report the locations that they had been told were the burial grounds of their ancestors. And I think this is a critical piece, because if we had a national map of where abandoned African American cemeteries were reported to exist, then that is something that would benefit developers when they're looking at a particular parcel, determine if it's something that they want to acquire for a potential development, to give them the alert in advance of planning a project that indeed that is someplace that has a report of a burial ground, and if they are going to proceed with that particular location, they should invest in archaeological surveys, determine if a burial ground is present before getting a major development planned. Shell Oil is actually a backer of the bill as it came out the last time. Shell purchased a very large land acquisition in coastal Louisiana for a big new chemical plant development, and had archaeological studies done at the request of the Corps of Engineers. And it turned out that they had two extremely large plantation cemeteries that between them had more than 1,000 burials. And given that recognition, Shell decided to just landmark that property and hold on to it as undeveloped land, but not to proceed with the development. So we're hopeful that the bill comes out of Representative Adams' office in the near future. And we think it will be in a much more receptive state when it does. And Senator Brown is already talking about a bill on the Senate side of the House. Interestingly, there's another bill that is now being talked about. It's not yet a bill. There's another action that is being talked about by our colleagues at the Society of Black Archaeologists, and that is to create an African American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So those of you that are archaeologists are familiar with NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And what this proposal is that there should be a bill that would require museums, universities, and other institutions that hold the skeletal remains of African Americans to inventory those remains, to seek to identify who those remains belong to, and to ultimately repatriate those remains in some form or another. There are unfortunately thousands of African American bodies sitting on the shelves of various major universities and anthropology departments, dating from a time where studying human anatomy and physical anthropology made use of the skeletal remains, and where African Americans were, as an oppressed section of the society, were the ones quite often selected to be the skeletons in the study labs. And so that is another action that is being discussed, and I hope will also result ultimately in a bill. So that is the Avondale Burial Place and where things currently stand with the African American Burial Grounds Network bill. And I would be pleased to answer questions. So, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I am absolutely fascinated. First of all, that was an incredible video. I loved so much photographs and interviews with living descendants. That's the gold standard of archaeology, right? Is being able to connect your work directly to the people that it influences and the people who think that it matters. So that was wonderful. I've also in the chat linked to your SHA resources, the abandoned burial grounds. Is that the correct one? Okay. And I've also linked to the congress.gov website that has the bill sponsored by Representative Alma Adams. I don't know that that's the most current or recent bill, but I don't
think it's been reintroduced yet. The latest I've heard is that they're still working on the reintroduction.
Yeah, this is from the 116th Congress. So I think that was the last one. So if you guys want more information on that, you can check in our chat. Also, if you're watching this later on YouTube or Facebook, we'll try to include that in our comments as well, in our comment section. So I guess my major question for you is, what was your participation like in the cemetery project, the Avondale Burial Place project?
So I'm the project manager, and I'm proud of the video. That's my script. So I was out on frequent visits when we were doing field work. working with our historians in trying to track down the descendant communities. I was there for the descendant community visit, and that was a wonderful experience. I have to say, they came in on buses, and I had vans ready to drive because it's a pretty good hike, and it was Memorial Day. It was warm, and I had vans ready to drive them out to the site, and they said, no, we want to walk. And so they walked on the field roads coming out to the site. And of course, the visual of that was just a wonderful, felt so correct in the video as it was pulled together. But it was, again, Skip Mason, the family was so open and receptive to working with us. We were a little bit nervous inviting, okay, we're going to invite these descendants who are descendants, we think, of the cemetery, we don't know for certain, to witness burials being excavated, and we were not certain how that might be received. And no, they were absolutely fascinated. And as like Skip said, we were learning about those individuals through the excavation and analysis we were doing. And so it was a great experience.
Yeah, that was touching to watch. I can only imagine how great it was to be there. We've got a couple of questions in our comments. We are 5 minutes before the end of the hour. Would you be okay sticking around for just a little bit? I don't want to ruin, like, take up your whole night. But okay, Sheila Jones asks, would you recommend the enactment of bills at the state level, such as the African American Burial Grounds bill that was proposed in Maryland?
So yes, and if the SHA website, Washington University did a study of state burial laws, and there are some states that do not have any burial laws at all. So I think every state should have a burial law that gives protection to unmarked burial grounds. But I think African American burial grounds deserve their own level of protection because they quite often lack the land ownership, the deed registration, the other things that go with a cemetery being recognized as a cemetery and a place that requires that has legal consequences.
Yeah, particular here in Utah, I'm not seeing that we have laws or regulations that are at least listed on the SHA website, the Society for Historical Archaeology. So I think there's room for improvement there if people do want to see these things at the state level. I think that's great.
And as a follow-up to that, I'd also love to see states giving funding to getting them identified. My biggest concern is that the elders who know where those burial grounds are not going to be with us much longer. Their children have often moved on. In situations like Avondale, everybody had moved on, but right now we can reach out, we can learn about burial ground locations that another 10 years from now, there won't be anybody in the community that even knows there's a cemetery out there that we should be aware of and alert to.
Yeah, having the informants present is so important because it's not something that we as archaeologists solicit enough, but critical to starting that. And along that line, we did have someone ask, how do they initiate an archaeological project at a church cemetery? And someone had a follow-up question, what would the project like that cost?
So we do work with, our firm also provides geophysical survey. And we've done work with a number of different church cemeteries, predominantly surveying for unmarked graves that may be present in the South. Cemeteries are typically segregated. So let me back up. If it's an African American cemetery, obviously we're not looking at segregation, but white cemeteries, as we go later into the postbellum era, were typically segregated. And there's quite often in the African American sections, poorer markers, fewer markers, impermanent markers. So we've done geophysical survey, GPR, to identify the locations and make sure that the cemetery in its totality can be mapped. The other thing I think that we see sometimes on church cemeteries is that we will see unmarked graves out on the edges of the cemetery. There may be individuals who are not affiliated with that church, who have somebody in the family pass or a colleague, friend pass, need a place to bury and may come in at night and make a burial out on the edge of a cemetery in something that is not a formal plot. So geophysical survey is the way to go. The cost really depends on the size of the area that is looking at to be surveyed. But typically, if it's an existing cemetery, it's going to be fairly narrow bands out on the edges of the cemetery to identify where the unmarked burials are, and it's probably a few $2,000 to $3,000 or so in cost, not overly expensive.
Yeah, and so that's for the identification. If one wanted to go all the way through with, some sort of exhumation and analysis, a DNA analysis to find ancestors, that's a cost above and beyond.
Well, and that's also there. You're at the point of dealing with the descendant community directly.
Yes.
So, I mean, in Georgia, with the burial law here, if someone wants to relocate a cemetery, they first need to have an archaeological survey done to have it fully defined. But then they need to do genealogy and outreach to identify the descendant community and get the descendant community to agree to the not necessarily fully agree because they're the landowners, but at least make the descendant community aware of the relocation and the plans for where the remains are going to be reinterred.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it did seem like, that's pretty involved. You guys used so many different types of research. You used genealogical records, you used census records. That was a lot to do.
Yeah. It's not a simple process.
Yeah, well worth it, but not something to undertake lightly. And we've still got a little bit of time for a couple more questions. I have one in the docket from Dr. Merritt. He asks, Dr. Joseph, many of the attendees are here in Utah, but how can those listening or watching help this effort?
Well, I think first thing is I think we all need to recognize that one of the issues that is confronting us with racism in this country is the lack of respect for the African American past. We're all concerned about addressing racism in the present. Can you imagine if the burial grounds of your family were turned into a shopping center with little or no concern at all? I think and those of us that are white are used to an environment where our place in our property is respected. And I think unfortunately for African American burial grounds, that is all too often not the case. There's no recognition being given to these cemeteries. There are countless records of them being damaged or destroyed by development, and that to me is heart-wrenching and something that I think if we can address the affronts to the African American past, that is one of the things that we can help do to heal the racial divide. And I'll put a plug in for a journalist. Go search Paul Guzzo, Guzzo, with the Tampa Bay Times. Paul has been great in researching the locations of African American burial grounds in Tampa and then documenting what has happened to them. And time again, he has been able to trace an African American burial ground and find that it's now a shopping center, it's now a golf course. It is not recognized at all as a cemetery.
That's fascinating, and that's out of Tampa, Florida. I think I found him, so I'll link to that in just a moment.
Yeah, we talk from time to time. He's a great guy. I appreciate what he's doing.
Yeah, no, that's important work. Great. So we'll wait for another minute for any more questions, but in the meantime, I did want to mention a couple more resources that I'll put in the chat right now. We have a historic cemeteries program in our Utah State Historic Preservation Office. And our cemeteries database manager, Amy Berry, would absolutely love to chat with you about any cemeteries that you know of here in Utah. In particular, we have that database and we'd love to keep adding to that database, but she also conducts workshops on how to clean and maintain historic headstones and modern headstones as well. So a lot of people have taken those trainings and have absolutely loved them. So if you are interested, and especially if you are in the state of Utah, definitely check out those resources. That might be something that you can get started on right away if this is of interest to you. One last one. Bertha Jackman asks, what was the timeline for the Avondale Burial Place from the beginning to now? And she also wants you to know that that video was outstanding.
Thank you. So it was about the recovery process from when GDOT recognized they had a cemetery through the excavation and reburial. It was about a 5-year process. So, GDOT had the initial reports that there was a cemetery present. They then went out and selected us as a consultant because they knew we worked with cemeteries to go out and see if those reports were in fact correct. Once we determined that indeed there was a cemetery there, they went back to their planners to see if it could be relocated. Unfortunately, by that point in time, you heard in the video that they were through the environmental process. Well, they were also much of the way along with the right-of-way acquisition. They were purchasing the land to put the road exactly in this alignment, and then they had constraints with a wetland and historic homes and another cemetery on either side. So they had some limitation that really kept them from being able to move. So at that point in time, they decided to do the archaeological recovery and reburial.
I was on mute, of course. Well, I think that about wraps it up for this evening. Unless, is there anything else that you would like to add before we let you go for the evening? And thank you for the extra time.
No problem at all. It has been fun. It's something I love, so I don't mind. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
Thank you. This has been touching and inspiring. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight and have joined us for all of our brown bags and all of our flagship capstone events this month. It's been a ball. And we do look forward to being able to see you all in person again.